Good evening. I'm Teresa Skupik, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, June 2nd. Canada's premiers headed into a meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney in Saskatoon today, armed with their wish list of major nation-building projects that could support the economy in the face of a U.S. trade war. Mr. Carney asked the premiers to each pass on 5 suggestions for national infrastructure projects, and today's meeting aimed to identify the ones that will make the final cut to be fast-tracked using legislation Ottawa may introduce as early as this week. The conversation is taking place against the backdrop of an ongoing trade war with the United States, renewed debate about separatism in Alberta, and a push to break down interprovincial trade barriers to encourage more trade between provinces and less reliance on trade with the U.S. In the opening statements, Mark Carney laid out the history behind the First Minister's meeting and the deals that have been accomplished through it.
In 1985, it was the run-up to what would then be the free trade agreement with the United States, and a long process of integration that brought great prosperity to both our nations, culminating in the best trade deal ever, as someone once called it. Some call it USMCA, we call it CUSMA. But that situation, as we all know, has changed. We're in the process of redefining our relationship with the United States. That's ongoing. Mr. LeBlanc and others leading those discussions, but working very much in partnership around this table in terms of our priorities and how we're defining it, but also taking matters very much into our own hands.
Before the meeting began, Canada's premiers answered questions from reporters about their expectations and priorities for the discussions ahead. A reoccurring question focused on whether the premiers share Danielle Smith's stance on fast-tracking the oil pipeline project. To start, Doug Ford said the part of the project that he agrees with is unity.
Well, what I agree with, we all have to come together. This is really our first meeting to have this discussion. Again, it's about building our relationships back and forth. I give the Prime Minister all the credit to come out here to Saskatchewan. We haven't had a FMM meeting for 40 years here, so he's putting the olive branch out, and we'll have a great discussion.
The premiers of the territory shared their perspective of the project, saying that there are a series of options on the table.
Not everyone is going to get everything they want, but there's opportunity. There's a lot to do in Canada. A lot of these projects, they might not start on day one. Maybe they're going to start down the road. So I think this is the start of a conversation. But if there's a project of national significance, that's good for all of us. And so I'm going to support all of my colleagues who see their projects advanced. And I hope to see some of ours advanced as well.
The general feeling at the table is making sure that we're supporting the provinces that want to see their resources get to Tidewater. And it seemed as though everybody wanted to focus on supporting each other. Of course, every specific province and territory will have different resources. We all have resources that we want to get to market. Everybody knows that it's incredibly important at this particular time with what's happening with our this tariff battle. So do I think it's important? Yeah, I do think it's important. But I think there's been a solution put on the table, which is looking at the opportunity for an economic corridor that can be built from British Columbia right through to Manitoba. So I think there's a series of options on the table that might make things a bit more easier to come to a conclusion on.
And Quebec, which has discussed separatism countless times throughout history, touched on the economic impact of the pipeline.
I didn't see the project, if there's one. So we need to see what's the economic impact for Quebec, what is the impact on the environment. So what I say is that if there's a project going through Quebec, we'll study it. That's all what I said. First, I've been invited here by Mr. Carney, not by Danielle or whoever. Second, he asked us to bring economic projects. So we have many economic projects in electricity, in critical minerals. So we'll see with Mark Carney what is he ready to finance or to help or to push. But I first need to see what are the projects, including the one of Danielle.
Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down with oil and gas executives in Calgary on Sunday to discuss partnerships and to get their input for his plan to make Canada an energy superpower. In his first visit to Calgary since being sworn in as Prime Minister, Mr. Carney held a closed-door roundtable with more than 24 members of the energy sector. Prior to the closed-door meeting, reporters were only allowed to hear a few comments from the Prime Minister before being asked to leave the room.
Partnership is a theme for our discussion this morning. It's a critical time for our country. The world's certainly more divided and dangerous, and the imperative of making Canada an energy superpower in all respects has never been greater. The importance of diversification in all its respects. A superpower has tanks, has aircraft carriers, has jets, has drones, has hard and soft power, has all aspects. And our country has immense resources that many of you have developed in oil and gas, across hydrogen, nuclear, clean energy and other aspects, and emerging technologies from SMRs through to carbon capture and storage. And our job is, and our opportunity is to develop all of those. And develop those in partnership. Now, we will do everything we can at the federal government level to support those partnerships.
Amid economic uncertainty in Canada due to U.S. tariffs, Ontario has reached agreements with Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Prince Edward Island with the aim of taking steps to reduce trade barriers among the provinces. Ontario Premier Doug Ford signed separate memorandums of understanding with Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, and PEI Premier Rob Lance in Saskatoon on Sunday ahead of the first ministers' meeting there.
So I'm proud to be here today with my friend, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, to sign this MOU and to improve Saskatchewan's partnership yet again. Another step in signing this partnership agreement with Ontario. A step that will again, continue our effort in removing any and all trade barriers, not only with Ontario, but removing any and all trade barriers across the nation. These actions will not only strengthen our respective economies in Saskatchewan and Ontario, but they will benefit workers and businesses in each of our jurisdictions, and indirectly are going to greatly enhance the Canadian economy, understanding that our Canadian economy is a sum of the regional strengths and the regional economies that we have. So I'm excited by the opportunities ahead, and I'm confident that moving forward we will find even more common ground in advancing and improving our interprovincial trade relationship between Saskatchewan and Ontario, and continue, maybe even over the course of the next day or so, to advance our interprovincial trade relationship across the nation.
Ontario signed an MOU in Manitoba in May and with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in April. Our correspondent Wyatt Sharp joined us for more on the agreement.
The province of Ontario has now signed MOUs with several of the other provinces. Now, an MOU really has to do, it's called a Memorandum of Understanding, and it relates to kind of this idea of free interprovincial trade, which really has been sparked, and a lot of discussions have been happening with respect to this topic after Donald Trump took office in January. And he kind of came in under this idea of an America First ideology, where he was really very much trying to prioritize trade within the United States from state to state. And so he actually introduced a number of ideas in his own right. And so Canada now was kind of looking to follow a similar kind of trajectory and pathway by ensuring that provinces have free trade with one another. This is something that people who are not in Canada right now oftentimes are surprised when they hear that the various provinces, despite being so similar to one another, do not have this in place as of right now. And I guess kind of, piggybacking, if you will, off of that point, even with respect to what the various provinces need to get from each other, you look at a province like Alberta that has a lot of oil and gas. This kind of MOU will make it so that Ontario is able to trade products with Alberta without having to pay some of the barriers that even foreign countries would have to pay. So that's one example. We are seeing some resistance, though, from a couple of provinces. Perhaps that's going to be brought up at some of the First Ministers meetings that are going to be taking place, even one happening today. And, that's really because if you look to a province like Quebec, obviously a province that very much is kind of grounded in separatist ideology, by, embracing this idea of free trade, that really goes against this idea of a more kind of nationalistic Canada. So certainly there's a lot of kind of moving parts to this, and we're going to stay on it. And certainly, again, we'll see how the ministers' meeting unfolds today.
The provincially owned portion of Highway 407 is officially toll-free. The move, announced as part of the Progressive Conservative government's budget last month, took effect June 1st. The budget permanently removed tolls from the provincially operated Highway 407 East from Pickering to Clarington. Premier Doug Ford had promised the move earlier this year during the provincial election campaign as a way to provide relief for drivers. The province estimates removing the tolls would save daily commuters around $7,200 annually. Coming up after the break, firefighters from across Canada joined forces to battle against wildfires throughout the prairies. After that, we'll have an update on the World Junior Hockey trial, as defense lawyers representing 5 hockey players accused of sexual assault have closed their case, and no more evidence will be called at the trial. We'll have these stories and more news coming up right after the break. Firefighters from across the country are helping battle the prairie wildfires. Quebec Premier Francois Legault says a team of 20 firefighters will be sent to Manitoba this week, as well as a specialized management team to Alberta. More than 17,000 people have been displaced by wildfires in Manitoba, including 5,000 from the city of Flin Flon. Meanwhile, officials in Saskatchewan have issued an evacuation alert for dozens of residents in the small northern community of Timber Bay. A group of Indigenous leaders are calling on Prime Minister Mark Carney to showcase the game-changing potential of Canadian liquefied natural gas at the upcoming G7 Leaders Summit in Alberta. The National Post's Rahim Mohammed joined us to unpack what the letter from Indigenous leaders said.
So the Indigenous leaders are trying to set the agenda or help set the agenda ahead of the upcoming G7 summit, which is going to be taking place in the middle of June in Kananaskis, Alberta. They're basically saying to Prime Minister Carney, turn the page from some of Justin Trudeau's pessimistic messaging on LNG. So Justin Trudeau was never seen really as an enthusiastic cheerleader of Canada's oil and gas industry. In particular, he rebuffed a number of his G7 colleagues, notably Germany, saying that there was no strong business case at one point for shipping Canadian liquefied natural gas across the Atlantic. So they want Carney to start off on a more positive tone. And they're saying, look, basically for us, developing natural resources like liquefied natural gas for Indigenous communities across Canada, this is our straightest path to upward mobility, to escaping poverty, to escaping boil watery advisories, to improving our standards of living. A lot of these projects that are under development are either Indigenous owned or have a substantial Indigenous equity component. So Indigenous communities in particular have a lot to gain from the Carney government taking a more enthusiastic and a more accommodating approach to LNG development than Trudeau did.
We also discussed some of the major infrastructure projects that are needed to be able to export LNG.
So there are currently a few projects under development. The first one that is in the north coast of British Columbia in Kitimat is set to begin shipments later this year, this summer. 2 more are underway. Both are either Indigenous owned or have a substantial component within surrounding Indigenous communities. I'm not going to get too much into the science of LNG export terminals, other than to say that these are very expensive, large-scale facilities. One of the challenges with natural gas, which, as I'm sure you know, at room temperature, it comes in gas form, is getting it to a temperature where it can be liquefied and transported via vessel across the Pacific or across a marine body. So these are multi-billion-dollar projects with a substantial infrastructure component. But a big issue has been a regulatory environment in Ottawa that's persisted through the Trudeau government.
Lastly, Mr. Mohammed broke down the environmental impact if Canada expanded its LNG production.
So this is quite interesting, and this is something that is, I think, an ignored part of the conversation. There's still a lot of the world that generates its electricity using coal. Coal is one of the dirtier burning fossil fuels. Your average megawatt or whatever unit you want to use of natural gas burns about half the carbon emissions as coal. So there is an argument that building up and scaling up Canadian natural gas for shipment to places like China and India and elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific region will actually reduce the global footprint. There was recently a study by the Fraser Institute that said, if we were to double our production of natural gas and export the surplus to markets in Asia, Canada would globally reduce the equivalent of its entire carbon footprint for a year or thereabouts. So there's an argument to be made that scaling up LNG and being aggressive about getting Canadian LNG to markets in Asia in particular could actually reduce the global carbon footprint.
British Columbia is intensifying its approach to mental health and addiction care by extending involuntary treatment under the Mental Health Act. Premier David Eby announced plans to open secure facilities in Surrey and Maple Ridge, aiming to provide care for individuals with severe addictions, mental health issues, and brain injuries. However, this move has sparked controversy, with critics arguing that the province is repeating past mistakes. Alexander Keeler from Canadian Affairs reports.
A lot of folks trace the issue of BC's mental health and addiction crisis back to the deinstitutionalization of mental health care, and particularly the closure of Riverview Hospital. But there are some misconceptions about that I will get into. Basically, back in the 90s and early 2000s, BC closed down Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam. It was one of the last of its kind. It was a massive psychiatric hospital that once held nearly 5,000 people. The closure and the broader deinstitutionalization movement in the country was meant to address reported abuses and take people out of isolating institutions in favor of more humane, community-based services. So that was the promise and the plan, but experts and many non-experts say those services never really materialized. I spoke to Dr. Julian Summers at Simon Fraser University, who actually started his clinical career at Riverview. He told me BC never followed through on this vision. There was no sustained commitment to it, no real plan, and over time, things fell apart. I also spoke with Marina Morrow, a professor at York University who tracked the deinstitutionalization process in BC. She debunked the myth that people went straight from Riverview to Vancouver's downtown east side. However, she did confirm that some may have ended up there eventually over time, because the places that they were sent often were not equipped to handle complex psychiatric needs, and the system failed a lot of people. I also spoke to Laura Johnston from Health Justice, which focuses on coercive health law. And she told me that even though Riverview closed, BC is institutionalizing more people today than they did when Riverview was open. Between 2008 and 2018, involuntary hospitalizations in BC jumped nearly 66%, and they're still rising today. And just last year, BC Premier David Eby pledged to expand involuntary care. Johnston told me that this is continuing a flawed approach instead of investing in voluntary care, which includes things like therapy, counseling, and primary care. So the bottom line is BC closed Riverview without building what it promised. And now, instead of moving forward, the province seems to be shifting towards a reinstitutionalization. And experts told me that this can actually be more harmful. Summers from Simon Fraser University, he said long-term institutionalization can actually make people worse. It cuts them off from community. It damages their sense of autonomy. And it can lead to what's called institutionalization syndrome. So they're just unable to re-enter community and society. He also said that, BC needs to invest in real community-based care, not just group housing, but housing in recovery communities with strong supports and social connections, housing, proper nutrition, education, employment. He says these things are more important than medical care alone. He also pointed to Alberta's recovery-oriented communities as a good model. So these are live-in centers where people are getting therapeutic support, job training, and stability for up to a year.
Industry Minister Melanie Joly says that Ottawa is committed to using Canadian steel and aluminum in national infrastructure and defense projects, as President Trump threatens to impose more tariffs. Ms. Jolie met with aluminum industry leaders at a summit in Montreal on Sunday. She says the government is waiting to see if Mr. Trump follows through on his threat to increase steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% through an executive order. This comes as Mr. Trump said that he will double the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to 50% next Wednesday.
We are going to be imposing a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America, which will even further secure the steel industry in the United States. Nobody's going to get around that. So we're bringing it up from 25%. We're doubling it to 50%. And that's a loophole. And by the way, I have to tell you, I believe that this group of people that just made this investments right now are very happy, because that means that nobody's going to be able to steal your industry. It's at 25%, they can sort of get over that fence. At 50%, they can no longer get over the fence. So congratulations to everybody and to you for making a great deal. You just made a better deal, right?
When we return from the commercial break, we'll be joined by Brendan Caldwell to discuss the impact of unemployment on the stock market and the economy overall. After that, Canada Post has rejected a request from the union representing about 55,000 of its workers. We'll have these stories and more news right after the break. Defense lawyers representing 5 hockey players accused of sexual assault have closed their case, and no more evidence will be called at the trial. Lawyers for the Crown and defense will make legal submissions to the judge next week. Michael McLeod, Dylan Dubé, Alex Formanton, Carter Hart, and Cal Foote have all pleaded not guilty to sexual assault. McLeod has also pleaded not guilty to an additional charge of being a party to the offense of sexual assault. The trial centers on an encounter with a woman inside a London, Ontario hotel room in the early hours of June 19, 2018. The court heard testimony this morning from London Police Detective Lindsay Ryan, the officer tasked in 2022 with reviewing the 2018 police investigation into the allegations. Canada Post has rejected a request from the union representing about 55,000 of its workers to send their ongoing labor dispute to binding arbitration. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers made the request in a statement issued on Saturday, saying that it was inviting Canada Post to a fair, final, and binding arbitration process to resolve negotiations that have dragged on for months without producing a new collective agreement. But the Crown Corporation dismissed the proposal in a response released on Sunday, saying it wants to restore stability to the Postal Service and arguing that the union's request for binding arbitration will do the opposite. Canada is facing a turning point in its economic trajectory. The national unemployment rate climbed to 6.9% in April 2025, the highest level since the end of last year, signaling growing unease across labor markets. This comes as economic growth continues to stall and pressure mounts on policymakers to make meaningful action. While the OECD maintains that Canada will likely avoid a technical recession in 2025, the economy is expected to experience stagnation throughout the year. To better understand how businesses and investors can adapt to this period of volatility, we're now joined by Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, thanks for joining me today.
Teresa, good to be here. Glad we still both have jobs.
Now, as of April 2025, Canada's unemployment rate, as I mentioned, rose to 6.9%, the highest level since the end of 2024. How do you think the rising unemployment rate will affect investor confidence?
Well, it's a funny thing. The real benchmark is what's going on in the U.S. and their unemployment rate, although measured differently than Canada, in the United States, they don't if you've stopped looking for work, you're not considered unemployed and therefore don't figure in the stats, which is odd. But here in Canada, I mean, our rate is an objectively higher than in the US. So I don't know that Canadian investors really look at the unemployment rate as the benchmark for how well companies in the economy are doing. What's happening, of course, in the last little while is that people are either not hiring or not keeping people as technology has begun to do a number of the jobs that particularly entry-level so-called white collar workers or office workers have been doing. So there's been a reluctance. It's been a terrible, for example, it's been a terrible summer for young people trying to get summer jobs, particularly if they're looking for something in a particular office type career. So uh, I think it's going to be very challenging. It'll infect investors in as much as, at least at the margins, there won't be as much money for investors to put into the market. And Canadian stocks are largely bought by Canadian investors. We have, there's home country bias in every part of the world where investors are more likely to buy stocks within the country in which they live. But it's particularly high in Canada, where we like our own brands. And so to the extent that there are fewer people with free disposable cash to put into the market, it may, at the margins, affect stock prices.
And what impact might the high unemployment rate have on Canadian corporate earnings forecasts and stock market performance in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, perversely, at least in some areas, it may actually help corporate earnings. Because again, if you're taking technology and using it in place of flesh and blood human beings, that could actually, at least in theory, boost earnings. Because in theory, those that remain are more efficient, more work can get done at less cost. So in theory, it could actually boost corporate earnings. In terms of stock prices, I think there is something of a correlation, but not a direct correlation between unemployment and stock prices. It's more, I think it's going to be more sector by sector, with other factors like trade being bigger influencers.
And what risk management strategy should Canadian companies and investors adopt in the face of these industries that are severely affected by trade?
Yeah, I think the trade is going to be the big one. So I had said, and I still stand by it, that Canadian companies or Canada as a country should not engage in retaliatory tariffs. I think if anything, and I'm encouraged that our Prime Minister has been talking about this, interprovincial trade barriers, barriers to trading within our own country, that is, should be taken down. Because maybe it's come as a surprise to people, but to move goods or services between Ontario and Quebec, or Quebec and Manitoba, or really anywhere across the country, there are actually barriers to doing that. To the extent that we are a united country with only 40 and a little bit million people, we do have to be more unified, particularly in a world that's becoming increasingly fragmented. When we could more easily trade directly with the United States or internationally, then okay, it doesn't necessarily matter that we be able to tap into the couple million strong Manitoba market. But absent a coherent global trade network, which was the case for the last several decades, as that's beginning to be dismantled, we have to be, I think, stronger across our country. From an investment perspective, how best to attack it? Well, you could say financial services should be somewhat immune to trade barriers, so the banks should do well. But of course, as we've seen in the United States, they will pursue nationalism by other means. I mean, the fine against the TD Bank for money laundering ran into the billions, and worse, they've been legally prevented. The bank has been legally prevented from expanding in the U.S. And I think it's the case of all the big Canadian banks. There is a limit to how much you can grow in this country. Again, there's only 40 million people to bank for. So I do think that it's going to need to be a case by case, industry by industry, and indeed company by company investment strategy here in Canada as to which ones will do better than others. Ones that I think are particularly vulnerable continue to be ones reliant on trade, particularly in industries that the U.S. president seems to think are going to be able to be built fully in the United States, like auto parts. So I think that could be a tricky one. On the other hand, when you're looking at an industry like auto parts, to the extent that this whole protectionist discussion goes away, or at least diminishes in importance, you could see a rebound in auto parts and other heavily U.S.-oriented exporting sectors.
And which industries have shown resilience in the face of a weak job market? And can these industries absorb unemployment labor in other industries?
I think it'll be tricky because again, this unemployment. I mean, there was an article in the papers just over the weekend about people who've gone to school to be computer programmers. Well, you think if you could learn to code, learn to make the computers work, surely always be a job for you. But apparently, one of the highest unemployment rates amongst recent graduates is with computer programmers, people who know how to code. I have been resilient in my knowledge, not even to know how to make a spreadsheet work. I can tell you what's wrong with your spreadsheet and whether the numbers that are spit out of it are correct or not. So interpreting the data, I can do, but those that actually know how to put the data together are actually under a lot of job pressure because apparently AI can do a lot of that stuff. So um, I do think it'll be tricky to go from industry to industry. Now, every generation over the last little while has thought, okay, this time it's it. This time we're not going to be as well off as our parents. Going back to even Generation X when we graduated in the early 90s, and then the internet came along. I do think the present generation will be resilient to the changes that have taken place because they are much more familiar with the technology and will figure out a way to improvise, adapt, overcome, and indeed create their own employment opportunities.
Now, we do have about a minute, but you talk about how computer science majors, you thought they would always have a job, now they might not. Do you think that this unemployment rate rising, even though people are showing resiliency or younger Canadians are showing resiliency, do you think that people are going to be more hesitant to not go to school because they're seeing a high unemployment rate?
I think school should be done differently than it has been. It was one thing in my youth when it was maybe $2,000 tuition, 1980s, 1990s dollars tuition to get a degree in something. It was interesting intellectually and a wonderful place to park a young person until their frontal cortex was somewhat fully formed. But I think there will be a greater emphasis on apprenticeships. Uh, Even those that go to university realize that they need to know how to do something practical at the end of it. So I do think university need to be done differently. That all having been said, my master's degree is Renaissance English literature, and be able to express oneself and have an interpersonal connection.
Ukraine's security service said on Sunday that a Ukrainian drone attack has destroyed over 40 Russian planes deep in Russia's territory, while Moscow hit Ukraine with missiles and drones just hours before a new round of direct peace talks in Istanbul. A Ukrainian official told the Associated Press the attack took more than a year and a half to execute and was personally supervised by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. He said that the operation involved drones transported in containers carried by trucks deep into Russian territory. Russia's defense ministry confirmed the attack on 5 airfields. Our correspondent Adam Zivo joined us from Ukraine for more on the operation.
On Sunday, June 1st, Ukraine launched Operation Spiderweb, an unprecedented operation in which over 100 cheap plastic drones, which were smuggled into Russia over the course of 18 months, were deployed at air bases all throughout Russia's territory, including thousands of kilometers behind enemy lines. These drones detonated and destroyed approximately 1/3 of Russia's strategic bombing capacity, so at least 40 aircraft. It is a devastating blow to Russia's war capacity, as well as a major psychological blow and a potential economic blow, as the attack raises concerns about the security of Russia's logistics chains.
Adam also unpacked what makes this attack different from previous ones carried out.
What is new about this attack is that never before have cheap plastic drones been launched from within enemy territory, at least so deeply within enemy territory, to disable far more expensive and far more lethal aircraft. We know that drone warfare has been a staple of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict for over a year now. Over 80% of casualties on the front lines are caused by these drones, but we've never seen them deployed deep within Russian territory like this before. Now, the Ukrainians will sometimes, well, actually quite often, send drones hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers into Russian territory to attack oil refineries, to attack, let's say, other military infrastructure within Russia. But these drones are easy to track and sometimes easy to intercept because they are relatively slow and they travel over the course of, a very long distance. So the Russians can see what's happening. But what happened here is that the Ukrainians brought these drones in, they smuggled them in little tiny fake wooden houses that were then put on trucks. And the trucks were then driven basically just next door to these air bases. And then Ukrainian operators were stationed near the trucks. And then when the time came, a roof opened up on all of these little houses simultaneously at all of these different trucks, at all of these different air bases. And then these operators took these drones, flew them a short distance to these planes, and then blew these planes up. And then the drone operators were evacuated from Russia before the Russians even knew what was happening. And so by bringing the deployment points so close to key military infrastructure, the Ukrainians were able to bypass normal air defenses and cripple Russia's military capacity.
Russian state media and Vladimir Zelensky say that the latest round of direct peace talks between Russia and Ukraine ended this morning after just over an hour. Before the meeting, Mr. Zelensky spoke on how important a ceasefire is for the country.
In parallel, in Istanbul this hour, there is our team. I had conversation with my Minister of Defense in the early morning. So they are preparing for meeting. I'm not sure that Russians will be ready for some productive meetings, but we always have to count on some decisions. For us, very important is ceasefire, unconditional, of course, ceasefire, and humanitarian issues as to bring back adopted children, and of course exchange of warriors, and to do everything for other prisoners, civilian prisoners, and journalists, political prisoners. So it's very important to get them all whole.
Officials said the Ukrainian delegation was led by Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, and Russian state media reported that Vladimir Medinsky headed the Kremlin team. A man reportedly set people on fire in Boulder, Colorado, leaving multiple individuals injured as people gathered for a demonstration in support of the Israeli hostages. A suspect is in custody, and police are investigating what FBI officials immediately called a targeted terror attack. Though this morning, local authorities said that it was too early to define the attack and that the motive remained under investigation. Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern gave an update on the attack.
What I will say, lastly, is this was a beautiful Sunday afternoon in downtown Boulder on Pearl Street, and this act is unacceptable. I hope you'll join me this evening as we're working through this investigation. We are working, I just came from the command post. We've got dozens and dozens of people here, our state, local, and federal partners, working through this to figure out exactly what happened. I ask for a little bit of patience as we do that, but also I ask that you join me in thinking about our victims, the families of those victims, and everyone involved in this tragedy. Our hearts go out to them, and we are going to do everything we can to work as hard as we can throughout the evening to provide more information and get answers for everyone.
The suspect was charged today with a federal hate crime and had a scheduled initial court appearance later in the day. The United Kingdom's Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that the UK military is moving to war-fighting readiness as he unveils the government's defense spending plans.
A new era in the threats that we face demands a new era for defense and security, not just to survive in this new world, but to lead. We will never gamble with our national security. Instead, we will act in the national interest. And that's why I place national security at the heart of our plan for change. That's why I launched this strategic defence review within days of becoming Prime Minister. And now it has delivered. And today, following through on this review, I want to set out 3 fundamental changes that we're going to deliver. First, we are moving to warfighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces. When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready. And frankly, to show them that we're ready, to deliver peace through strength. Now, Britain has the finest servicemen and women in the world. We're showing them the respect that they deserve by delivering the biggest armed forces pay rise in 20 years and by pledging today that we will end the hollowing out of our armed forces. We'll build a fighting force that is more integrated, more ready, more lethal than ever, backed by a stronger strategic reserve, fully trained and ready to mobilise at any time. Second, everything we do will add to the strength of NATO. As we step up to take greater responsibility for our collective defence, the NATO alliance means something profound. That we will never fight alone. It is a fundamental source of our strategic strength. That's why our defence policy will always be NATO first.
According to the French Interior Ministry, 2 people have died and hundreds have been arrested across France after Paris Saint-Germain fans celebrated the club's victory in the Champions League final. Flares and fireworks were set off, bus shelters smashed, and cars torched amid wild celebrations as PSG won the biggest prize in European club football for their first time in their history. The Apprentice, a Canada-Ireland-Denmark co-production about the early years of U.S. President Donald Trump, won Best Motion Picture at Sunday's Canadian Screen Awards. Toronto's Daniel Beckerman is the lead producer of the Ontario shot film, which portrays how Mr. Trump owned his persona, power tactics, and media savvy under the mentorship of controversial fixer Roy Cohn. The film has won 5 Screen Awards in total, including Best Performance in a Lead Role for Sebastian Stan's turn as Mr. Trump and Best Supporting Actor for Jeremy Strong's portrayal of Mr. Cohn. I'm Teresa Skubic, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on X and TikTok. Good night, Canada.